It all started around 1996, when I came across an article by someone named Olavo de Carvalho. I read the text once, twice, 3 times, and I cursed out loud. How could someone dare to say such things about the supposedly important intellectuals of the Brazilian left? How could anyone question the wonderful ideals of the socialist revolution? How could this reactionary have the audacity to call communism a murderous regime? And how did he have the nerve to speak of Aristotle, Plato, Leibniz, Nietzsche, Marx, world literature, and Christianity as if he were a well-versed expert in each of these subjects? The most infuriating thing was that the guy wrote well. Back then, at 25 years old, I was a committed leftist activist. Without my comrades in the union and the party suspecting a thing, I got hooked on Olavo's texts. I read them in secret. I found The Collective Imbecile in a bookstore in my city, and, lacking the courage to buy the book, I started reading it bit by bit, a few pages each day, right there in the bookstore. I still read and cursed, but I was also captivated by the power of the arguments, the flow of the style, and the undeniable erudition of the author. I could never have imagined that, 17 years later, I would be invited to spend a week at the home of philosopher Olavo de Carvalho in Richmond, United States, to discuss the spiritual decay of Brazilian culture with him and 4 other writers. Upon entering Olavo's library, where the sheer number of books was only less astonishing than the fact that they had actually been read and understood by their owner, I felt that my life, in a way, had been leading up to that moment. After those 6 days of intense debate and reflection, I would never again allow myself to compromise on intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty, according to Professor Olavo, is defined simply: never pretend to know what you don't know or be unaware of what you do know. For example, I know what the São Paulo Forum is. In 1990, leftist leaders, led by Mr. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, met in São Paulo with the explicit goal of regaining in Latin America the power that communist regimes had lost in Eastern Europe the previous year with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The strategy of the Latin American left would no longer follow the Bolshevik model of power seizure and police terror. The path would be the gradual conquest of hearts and minds through a careful cultural domination inspired by Antonio Gramsci, the modern-day Machiavelli. The so-called campaign for ethics in politics during the Collor administration was one stage of this process of cultural, political, and eventually social revolution. Today, most Latin American countries are governed by leftist leaders deeply connected and committed to the São Paulo Forum. For many years, Olavo de Carvalho was mocked as crazy and a supporter of conspiracy theories, while Brazilian culture, including its political aspects, was being vampirized by the Gramscian left, providing the support base for the klepto-populist government of the last 10 years. Conservatism and liberalism in Brazil were reduced to dust in the sense that they no longer possess any intellectual strength or presence in our country. But resistance will always emerge. This was the case in Eastern Europe, and it will be the case in Latin America. In Richmond, I had the honor of meeting some rare intellectuals who had not succumbed to the revolutionary mentality. Rodrigo Gurgel, the best literary critic active in the country, responsible for rehabilitating forgotten writers and unmasking overrated big names. Angelo Monteiro, author of the seminal essay, The Washing of the Donkey, and a prominent figure in the search for Brazilian identity through poetic language, in the tradition of Jorge de Lima, Alberto da Cunha Mello, and Bruno Tolentino. The political scientist, journalist, and translator, Bruno Garchegen, a leading defender of individual freedoms and a scholar of political conservatism, and the Portuguese professor and philosopher Miguel Bruno Duarte, a relentless critic of leftist ideological domination in Portuguese universities. As I always make a point of saying, I was in Richmond more as an observer and representative of a clearly minor literary genre, the Chronicle. Other names that still nourish hopes for better days in Brazilian culture were absent. Journalist Reinaldo Azevedo, Father Paulo Ricardo, writers Flavio Morgenstern, Felipe Moura Brasil, and Gustavo Nogi, Professor Jose Carlos Zamboni, and even singer and composer Lobão. Nonetheless, it was a remarkable experience, a turning point in the life of any provincial chronicler. I learned a lot, I listened a lot, I spoke little, yet still a lot. Richmond, Virginia, was the capital of the Confederate States during the Civil War. Lincoln's troops reduced the city to ashes at the end of the conflict. During our conversations, documented on video, Bruno Garchagin compared the current state of Brazilian culture to the despairing verses of T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland. Another image evoked by Garchagin was that of the Titanic gradually being overtaken by icy waters. Personally, I believe the devastated Richmond of the Civil War offers us an accurate metaphor for Brazil during the PT era. Legend has it that only one house was left standing in Richmond at the time. The very house that now houses the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, the city's most illustrious son. In front of the house stands an oak tree, as if it were a witness to the sorrows and tragedies that took place there. There is also an oak tree in front of Professor Olavo's house. Under the shade of the old tree, visitors gathered every day of that unforgettable week. I wish everyone would speak and write with their heart in their hand, said our host in one of those conversations, alongside his dear family who welcomed us so well. There, he told many stories about his life, narratives that would certainly make for a fine book. There, he spoke fondly of Arno Price and João Leonardo, my father's two best friends, who died after joining the armed struggle in the 70s. There, my life began again, just like on the day I got married and the day my son was born. From now on, I will only write with my heart in my hand. At 43, I finally know who I am. Thank you, Olavo.